is folks really looking at the B Corp ecosystem as a leader and how we activate around these. And so what that means and what that looks like, for example, is diving a bit deeper into one of the most revolutionary programs that I've seen thus far in the ecosystem, which is the open hiring policy led by Grayson Bakery. What we've seen with this program is organizations across the aisle really want to understand how can they incorporate this program within their organization. So let's take, for example, IKEA. This was a recent collaboration between Grayson where they wanted to understand what does this policy, what does this program look like in action, and then wanted to now adopt that program into their organization where they're starting to implement that across the globe. In addition to that, Grayson has now recently partnered with an organization in the Netherlands working with McDonald's franchises, I mean, out of all companies, right? It's really wanting to understand how can we incorporate open hiring policy within, these businesses, because again, to Grace's point, businesses are at the forefront in addressing some of the tension and some of the gaps, what we're seeing in society, whether it's with returning citizens, whether it's with folks from under-resourced communities. Companies are taking a chance and understanding that as we continue to work with community and identify some of this untapped resource, we're starting to see better just organizational growth in all of the ways, from bottom lines to staff retention to community trust and to really seeing a societal level impact. Another idea and another program that I'd love to uplift is our income advance policy program, which is led by Rhino Foods, small, mighty company based in Vermont, really leading with, what it means to support team members, employees within the organization, but also having a larger impact when it comes to closing the wealth gap. And so this program focuses on providing financial support to leaders within the company and community that would essentially support them in some of the emergencies that they're going through in life, while it also allows them to understand, how can they better strengthen some of their financial resources, but also how they can continue to support their families in ways that really addresses the wealth gap in ways that, oftentimes our government makes these promises and don't deliver, or other sectors make these promises. And so what we're seeing is these companies really leading by example, and now have been adopted nationally when we're talking about it from the region of the United States and Canada, where now it's become its own nonprofit. And now other companies are adopting this program and working in tandem with banks to be able to implement these programs within their HR teams. And what they're seeing is, again, companies not being subjected to predatory loans. And so therefore really feeling confident in that they're able to kind of address some of the tensions around financial resources that they're having, companies being able to fully invest in the roles that they have because financially they're secured. What we're seeing again is companies really being able to think of these non-orthodox approaches and really supporting their communities, because their communities are the backbone of what it is that they do. And that's just two of the many programs that exist. We also have an organization, it's technically a network within our ecosystem, the B Corp movement ecosystem, which is the decarceration fund, targeting returning citizens and supporting them and getting back on their feet, whether it's identifying how to purchase a home, finding jobs, the skill sets that they need to be able to identify the work that they need or the ways and resources they can support their family. This decarceration fund has really gone into some next level heights, which is now going into this second tier of funding series, I believe, of funding of almost $50 million, and these are all supported by B Corps. And so businesses do play a role in what we're seeing in terms of really addressing some of the tension around, justice, whether it's around, workforce development, whether it's being able to identify resources to support their community. And so I, ask and leave with us here today, how do we continue to leverage our businesses and supporting our communities and supporting our networks in ways that we can cross collaborate, we can lean in on each other to being able to understand how do we, again, move the needle forward in addressing some of these imbalances and injustices happening. And so I want to take a pause here because I recognize that was a lot of information, but thank you again for allowing me to share, and be happy to dive a bit deeper. And now I have the privilege of passing it along to Maggie from RBIJ. We'll share a little bit more, and again, we'll continue to engage. Thank you all.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Grace. Thank you, Hugues. Thank you to the entire B Lab team. I know that all of you probably have a lot on your plate, so it's no small thing to show up on a Thursday afternoon. So thank you so much for choosing to spend this with us. As mentioned, my name is Maggie O'Donnell. I am the Director of Policy and Advocacy at an organization called Responsible Business Initiative for Justice, or RBIJ. For those of you who are a bit less familiar with our work, which I imagine is in fact many of you, we are an international nonprofit. We work with the larger business community and business leaders within it, so folks like all of you, to be a force for good in society, particularly when it comes to workforce injustice issues, or what Grace alluded to and called criminal justice reform. So I'm going to share a little bit about our organization, but before I do that, I think it's always important to sort of provide some context about what the space we're working in is like. So to do that, I'm going to talk a little bit about our criminal justice system to begin with, and then I promise to jump into the good stuff. And I recognize that many of you are probably already deeply involved in this, so it might be a refresher, but I do think that some of these stats and things that you might hear are still helpful to keep sort of front of mind. So why do we work as an organization? Why do we work on this issue? The simple reason, I think, is just that this issue, criminal justice reform, impacts a lot of people. So our criminal legal system is vast, it's far reaching. We now know that 650,000 individuals leave incarceration each year and find themselves, most often than not, locked out of the labor market. We also know that 1 in 3 Americans, this is between 70 and 100 million people in this country, have some form of an old criminal record. So we're talking about a lot of people. And to compound that, we also know that it's not just an individual, it's also, of course, if you have children, it's your family, it's our communities. And so for everyone, those barriers and the stigmas associated with that can be lifelong. The effects can be passed down from generation to generation, and the barriers are huge. Experts estimate that on average, a person who leaves incarceration faces about 40,000 barriers to reentry. And those can be, again, huge things like access to employment, stable housing, your ability to pursue an education or get an occupational license. Can be really small. It can be the impact that you're not able to volunteer at your kid's school anymore. And then a lot of issues in between. And when it comes to employment in particular, so we are all businesses here, I work with businesses, employment is part of this issue. So we know that the unemployment rate for individuals who have a criminal record is 27%. That's higher than it's ever been for the US population as a whole. And studies have found that if you have a criminal record, it reduces your likelihood of getting a callback or a job offer by 50%. So it's an enormous impact. And then I promise I will get to the good news in a second, but some more bad news just to sort of lay it all out there about why this is so important. We, of course, know that our country's incarceration rate steadily increased for decades. It's higher than any other country in the world to date. And our system disproportionately impacts people of color. Today, some experts estimate that 1 in 5 Black men born in 2001 will be incarcerated at some point in their lives. That is an enormous figure. But as I said, it's not all bad news. And the good news is that there's a lot of roles for all of you and for businesses to play in this space. And we think it's actually incredibly important that you do. So I mentioned our organization, RBIJ. It's a long name, so I call it RBIJ. We work with businesses in this space. You might be asking why businesses in this space. I know that a lot of B-Lab folks are already sort of, you get that this is important for business to engage outside of sort of your bottom line, but there are some reasons why it's especially important on this issue. So for one, this is sort of the no-brainer piece, but we know that businesses are often considered to be the most trusted institutions right now across the globe. And companies, big and small, are really unlikely allies in this space. So I think Grace and Hugues both said this. We know that when businesses speak up, legislators listen, and when employers do things like open or fair chance hire, other employers are going to follow suit. We believe that folks like all of you deserve a seat at the table if you want to be there, and we want to help you do that, again, because of the influence that you all can have. And really do not undervalue the fact you have so much power as a business, because we know that that is true and have seen it happen many, many times. The last thing I'll say on just sort of the why here is that we know that both employees and consumers are demanding that companies, big and small, again, do more in this space and in criminal justice in particular. So we know that 89% of Americans said they would switch brands to one associated with a good cause. And the majority of employees that have been polled said they prefer to work for a company that does something like fair or open hiring. So with all of that sort of data and the what and the why, I promise to give you a little bit more context about us as an organization and how we fit into all of this. So We at RBIJ, my organization, we work with companies like all of you and leaders like all of you to do things in the space that will actually have an impact. And really, this is getting to the idea that you can do work from the outside or from the inside or both. And you can start really small and still have an enormous impact. So the easiest way that I think about sort of our three buckets of our work, which connects directly back to what you are able to do as well, are our three buckets. So it's one, reforming justice systems, two, restoring communities, and three, reframing the narrative around all of this work. So the first is around the policy. So I imagine you can all sort of think about what that means. We work with companies, again, big and small, on a variety of issues in this space to help move legislation or policy work at the state or the federal level, always with local partners on the ground. What we do is oftentimes we will work with folks like you and say, we're hearing directly from folks on the ground that there is a bill that is hoping to pass this session. We need businesses to support it because it's a workforce issue. We know that legislators will listen to businesses. We would love to do testimony or an op-ed or whatever it may be. And that's where you all come into play because, again, we know that legislators really care about people who have jobs in their district or employers more broadly. And so you have a lot of impact here. We work on a variety of issues in this space, so it can range from ending extreme sentencing, so things like abolishing the death penalty, all the way to clean slate legislation, which is criminal record sealing legislation, which allows somebody with a record to get a job more easily. So we work with folks across the board, big and small, as I mentioned, but policy really is a way to change the outside, right? But what about the inside? So thinking about looking inward to your company, what can you do? So we work with companies to look inward and think about their hiring practices, and that can be a variety of different things. So you heard from Grace that there's something called in Hugues open hiring. That's one possibility. There's also what we call first chance hiring or even second chance hiring. Those are all different versions of what we would call inclusive hiring. And things that I would really urge you to think about and consider if it might be possible for you, even at an extremely small scale. So to give you sort of the lay of the land, first chance for us is we have a program that we have with Walmart. It's called Unlock Potential. The whole point is to sort of disrupt the poverty to prison pipeline by providing meaningful career opportunities to emerging adults that are probably most at risk of incarceration. That's the first chance hiring piece. And we are really, really certain that it's helpful and important, and we connect businesses and community-based organizations in that space. But there's also something called second chance or fair chance hiring, which is simply just the act of attracting, recruiting, and employing people that have a criminal record or justice impacted themselves. And then open hiring is a really radical model pioneered by Grace and Baker, as you all know, that is basically just this idea that the first person who applies will get the job. And it's simple as that. You go in order of folks who have applied. And so we think that all of these are part of what makes up a really interesting portfolio of being a better, probably more inclusive employer. And again, you may not be at any sort of point in that stage, but I urge you to think about ways that you might be able to do small things there. The last of what we would do at RBIJ is our communications work, which is obvious. It's just helping reframe this narrative that it's good for business to do things in this space, but it's also actually really, really important to do it as well. So I'm going to leave you with some opportunities here. So across all of our work, we believe policy and inclusive, so inclusive hiring, so working from the inside and the outside isn't just good for the world, it's good for all of you as businesses. And so here's what I would say to you. On hiring, we know that, again, companies big and small, no matter where you are, coast to coast, international as well, it's really hard to keep and retain talent. And we know that hiring people from this talent pool is incredibly successful. There's a lot of data that suggests that second chance hires have a lower turnover rate than their peers and their employees. And it saves companies a lot of time when it comes to recruiting. We also know that the vast majority of HR professionals say that they perform better than or at the same level as their peers who don't have records. That's 85% about of HR professionals. And then on policy work, we know that legislation, like for instance, Clean Slate, which just simply automates record sealing for people who have an old criminal record after a set period of time. Things like that are actually also really good for the workforce because it opens up your talent pool, allows you to access more individuals who might be impacted by the system, who deserve a chance at a job. So again, I said I promised I would leave you with sort of the opportunity and some of the good news here. So for folks here that have any interest in this space, there are different versions of how you can engage. And I think I would urge you to reach out to me or to B-Lab just to learn more if you're just even curious and even feel like maybe you can't push on one lever, but maybe the other. I would say when it comes to advocating for change on the inside, really think about what's possible in terms of your hiring practices. I would consider you to expand your talent pool. I'd consider you, if you are in charge of hiring, to do that yourself, or to have some of those conversations with folks in your company where you know there might be a possibility, right? And it could be starting with one person, it could be starting with an entirely different hiring practice, or anything in between, but there's an opportunity there. And we are happy to help again if we can be useful, or to connect you with peers or folks like Grayston who are already so far along in this practice and are really a champion for this work. And then on the policy space, I would say, I would really encourage you to also think about what are some opportunities that I could happily put my business name next to because it's something that I deeply support or is good for my company. So that could be something public or private. It could be writing a letter to the governor or a legislator at the right time with the right message. It could be doing an op-ed or providing testimony. And again, we are really happy to help sort of direct you and tell you where things are moving or exciting or might be of interest to you, or even to help you do that work, like write it as well. But I'd really encourage you to think about just how much power you have as a company, even just by signing your business name to something. And the last piece I would say is that if that feels a little tough too, sometimes folks will say, well, I don't have a sign off to be the person who says we publicly are going to do something on a bill, or I don't have the power to hire somebody quite yet. I would say also think about you as a business leader and in your personal capacity. So one more example for you is that we also have a campaign, and we have other versions of this. I would urge you just to think creatively here. We have a campaign that's called Business Leaders Against the Death Penalty, and it's folks who are business leaders, but they're signing in their personal capacity. And so there's a world in which you're able to do things like that. So think creatively, I would say, about how you might be able to use your voice as a business leader or as a business to do something from the outside or the inside. I'm going to put a few links in the chat, but I'm actually really excited to now shift gears a little bit, because basically we have somebody here who I think embodies this idea of corporate activism and thinks a lot about sort of what it means to do good in business from the inside and the outside. So Palika, you are here. You are the youth activism manager. I'm going to pass it to you in a second. You work at Ben & Jerry's, so folks, it's a household name and probably doesn't need any introduction, but for folks who have been in fact living under a rock perhaps and haven't opened any of sort of the ice cream aisle in your grocery store, can you just tell us a little bit about you and your company, sort of the mission and values associated with it? And then we want to jump into some of the amazing work you've been doing. But let's start there.
Yeah, sure. Thank you for having me. My name is Palika. I use she, her pronouns. I'm based in Brooklyn, so I'm not in Vermont where the company is based. So I'm one of the new kind of remote hires, which I'll talk a little bit more about too. So I'm a digital organizer and strategist. I've been working in social justice movements for 12 years now in nonprofits, and Ben & Jerry's is actually the very first corporate activism role that I've ever taken on. I always said if I ever made the switch to corporate, it would be for Ben & Jerry's, and I think I'll explain a little bit why while I'm talking about what Ben & Jerry's does. But to give a little bit of background about myself, I was raised in a South Asian immigrant community on the south side of Chicago. My mom is the very first community organizer that I ever met. She probably wouldn't call herself that, but that's very much what she is. And I grew up kind of, going with her into libraries, people's living rooms, backyards, watching her kind of organize with other South Asian moms and women on everything from immigration, healthcare, navigating new food systems. And, she was doing all of this while she was herself new to this country and figuring out these systems for herself for the first time. But my mom is very much a born leader and one of the most resourceful people that I know. And everything that I know about being a good community member and what it means to live out my values, I've learned from her. My own career, I started in international affairs. I actually started at a racial justice movement in South Africa, where I learned so much and was able to bring so much of that knowledge back to my work here. I've worked in London, India, occupied West Bank, and then around 2015, I came back to the United States after Mike Brown Jr. was killed by police in Ferguson, Missouri. And I sort of started my career here organizing around racial justice. Most recently, I was the director of digital at Eighth Amendment Project, which is an organization fighting the death penalty, working to repeal the death penalty across the country, and also working to get people off of death row, sometimes just hours before an execution. Before that, I was working at Color of Change, which is the country's largest digital racial justice organization. And then before that, I was working on immigrant rights issues, prison justice issues at Witness. So at an organization called Witness. So I've worked on, you know, a range of different issues in a host of different, you know, countries. But I think at the core of all of my work is the belief that everyone has a role to play in creating a more just, a more equitable, a more compassionate world. And not only does everyone have a role to play, but everyone's needed. We're all needed in creating that world that we want to see. And that's what ultimately compelled me to this role here at Ben & Jerry's. It was the immense opportunity here to reach new people, more people, bring new people into the fight, educate, activate, and cultivate activists, just like my mom, who probably don't see themselves as activists, but who want to use the resources at their disposal to live a life that, live a life that lives out their values. And so a little bit about Ben & Jerry's now. So Ben & Jerry's is a B Corp. It's also a company rooted in social justice since its inception back in 1978. Ben & Jerry, who are in fact real people and real life best friends, are both also lifelong activists, anti-war activists, racial justice activists, cannabis justice activists, and they wanted to make ice cream and do good in the world, and believed that not only were both possible, but the only reason to have a company is to influence the community, influence the world for the better. And so supporting social justice issues are a part of the company's DNA, very much so. We have a 3-part horizontal mission, meaning that no one part of the mission is more important than the other. So there's the product mission, you know, make really good, delicious, fantastic ice cream. There's the economic mission to sustain economic growth. And then there's the social mission to make the earth a better place, to improve the quality of life and material conditions for historically marginalized communities, both locally, nationally, and internationally. And our social mission, it's not just the work that I do on our activism team, it guides all of our work, from sourcing brownies from Grayston Bakery, which we've talked a little bit about, another B Corp that's doing incredible innovative work around open hiring policy. It impacts how we create our packaging. We're working on sustainable packaging. We're constantly iterating on how to be more environmentally conscious and think about our contribution to the environment. And then it supports the work that I do, supporting progressive criminal legal system and racial justice campaigns that help advocate for policies and laws that are dismantling white supremacy and uplifting justice. So that's kind of the framework within which I work and everyone at the company works.
Thank you for that. I wish your mom was here right now, also on this webinar, because I feel like we all have a lot to learn from her as well. But no, that's wonderful, super helpful.
Yes.
I'm curious, you alluded to a bunch of sort of far-reaching, I think, social justice issues that Ben & Jerry's have worked on. Can you dig a little bit deeper and sort of give us a few examples of what some of those campaigns or issues that you have worked on, or Ben & Jerry's more broadly has worked on, and what that's really looked like?
Yeah. So I'll start by kind of sharing a little bit more about our specific activism model, and then some examples of the work we do. So I think what's so unique about Ben & Jerry's model of corporate activism, and what's resonated with folks like myself, is that we're not just cherry picking issues and campaigns to advocate on based on like a consumer report that's just going to further our bottom line, or based on what's trending culturally. I think we saw a lot of this in 2020, where companies made these kind of like half-baked statements, DEI statements, racial justice statements, and the public can tell. The public can tell and has a sense of, and I think consumers have a sense of when things aren't done authentically. We're not just posting and saying happy Pride once a year on Instagram. Our activism model, like I said, is to run these progressive digital criminal legal system campaigns that are working to dismantle white supremacy and drive very tangible change to policies and laws. So we're supporting campaigns to end cash bail, advocate for abortion, advocate for the rights of people who are incarcerated. We currently have a campaign fighting to make phone calls and communications in prisons and jails free across the country. There's a huge relation between being able to connect with your community when you're inside of prison and recidivism rates and low recidivism rates. We're doing work around ending slavery and unjust labor practices in prison and getting other companies to commit to not using prison labor in their supply chains, campaigns around defunding police, and then generally just working on campaigns and working with activism partners that are fighting to divest from carceral approaches to safety and instead invest in community-led solutions to safety. So, we're not just working on the quote unquote safe issues. And I think there's a few reasons why we're able to do that. One is, like I said, we have this long history of being a company that's rooted in social justice since the inception. Two, I think, we invest in people like myself. We have activism leads in our 10 largest markets across the country. And, all of our activism leads come from sort of similar backgrounds to me: civil society, political organizing, social justice organizing. And so we're the folks who kind of work as the liaison for this work and make sure that this work is being done ethically. And then I think the most important factor on how we're able to do this work well and ethically and impactfully is because we're very honest with ourselves that at the end of the day, we're still an ice cream company, right? We're not setting the strategy for a campaign. We should not be setting the strategy for a campaign. We're taking the strategic lead from activism partners on the ground and utilizing the tactics and tools at our disposal to support campaigns and uplift the work that's being led by those on the front lines. It doesn't mean that we're not making a meaningful impact. We're sometimes working quite collaboratively to set targets, goals, and I can share more examples of how, but we're very much honest about the fact that we're an ice cream company, and the people who are directly impacted and working on the front lines need to be setting the strategy for campaigns here. So we have a digital first activism model, which means that we're able to leverage the same kind of like best in class marketers, digital marketers and creatives who are working to sell ice cream to, millions of people around the world to also run social justice campaigns, which is pretty cool. It's definitely new for me coming from the nonprofit world to be able to tap into that kind of corporate creative brilliance as well. So we work with our activism partners to run paid campaigns that target specific, legislative constituencies, communities, demographics to help influence a target and move a piece of legislation. We also help drive action and education through our organic social media channels. So if you don't follow our Instagram channels, we have these kind of 101 explainers. We do TikToks and Reels that get a lot of engagement for folks who might be outside of the traditional reach of an NGO. And then we also show up on the ground when we're needed, with ice cream, with our ice cream truck. We've orchestrated billboards and mobile billboards, helping to pressure a political target. We've done op-eds, comm support. We have social justice related ice cream flavors that we've done. We work with our franchisees at our scoop shops across the country for on the ground support as well. Last year, one of our Florida scoop shops worked with the ACLU of Florida to get signatures. Signatures had to be in person. So they helped get in-person signatures from key target communities that allowed an abortion ballot initiative to be on the abortion this November. And now we're going to be supporting with digital engagement work there to, educate people on why it's important to vote yes for this abortion ballot initiative. And then we also, sign on to statements and letters when strategic. We've worked with RBIJ to sign on to the Business Leaders Against Death Penalty campaign. We've signed on to statements in support of ending juvenile life without parole with RBIJ as well. And then, generally research continues to show that people trust companies more than NGOs, more than the media. I think take that for what it is, but I think that's the reality of the landscape that we're living in. And so I think statements of support, statements of condemnation for racism, for oppression, they bear real weight. Just today, this morning, we put out a statement of support of Sonia Massey, who is a Black woman who was killed in Springfield, Illinois, by a police officer in her home after she called the police for help. I remember being on the front lines and taking note of Ben and Jerry's back in 2016 when they called out white supremacy, which was a really big deal from a corporation, or in 2020 when Ben and Jerry's was really the first company to make a meaningful statement in support of the Black Lives Matter movement. And those statements, they mean something, especially when they're backed up by the work internally and externally.
Yeah, it's simply incredible. And I will say one thing that I really love that you spoke to a little bit is being authentic, knowing that you are an ice cream company and yet also you can do a lot of things in this space. And I think for folks listening, I imagine you will know what sits authentically for all of you. And there'll be some issues that make sense for you and some that maybe don't make sense quite yet. And that's okay. But I do think it's worth considering where you sit on these issues and where you might be able to do something. So curious, we've heard a lot about sort of this idea from change from the outside, working on policy and social justice reform sort of initiatives. What is Ben & Jerry's doing internally? So when you look under, behind the curtain, what are sort of hiring practices or what are things that you all are doing internally that you think are really worth sharing?
It's a great question. While we're advocating for justice externally, it's just as important to be doing the same work internally. Companies are made up of real people who are impacted by the policies we're fighting for and against. And people also don't just check their values when they walk into their 9 to 5, right? People are interested, invested in this work. And so we strive to do this internally in a few ways. One, we're always working to create the same political, racial justice education moments internally as we do externally, so that everyone at the company knows about this campaign that we're working on, how it relates to our work, how it relates to our values, why we're doing this. Because sometimes, for someone kind of new to this, you're like, why is Ben & Jerry's talking about defunding the police? What does this have to do with ice cream? Well, let me tell you why. And just a reminder that all companies are political and are doing political work in some way. Some companies do it by lobbying, the government to be able to put toxins in our food and in our environment. And some companies are doing it in a much more external way, and some companies are doing it internally. But this idea that companies are apolitical, it's just not quite true. And so, like I said, one way that we're doing that is through the kind of internal education. We have our activism partners from places like Black Voters Matter, the Advancement Project, ACLU, Worth Rises, just to name a few that we're working with right now. We'll have them come in and we'll speak to folks and do brown bag lunches. We've had incredible talks from folks like the late and great John Lewis, civil rights hero, Big Frida, cultural icon. We've have a series called Empowerment. It's a play off of our empowerment ice cream flavor. And we have sessions that staff are required to take that focus on everything from racial justice to disability justice. And then we also have specific equity goals around increasing diversity with our staff. It comes as no surprise that Vermont is a very white state, which means that the company has to proactively work even harder to attract and include Black people and people of color on staff, and as a franchisee owners of the scoop shops. And so one way that they've been able to do this is by, opening up remote work opportunities. It's how I was able to join this team. We're also early movers of banning the box and advocating for not using criminal records in the first round screening processes for hiring. We've worked with RBIJ on the Unlocked Potential program that Maggie spoke a little bit about. And then I mentioned our relationship with Greyston Bakery earlier and their, innovative open hiring process. So Greyston Bakery, they're our most important ingredients, one of our most important ingredient suppliers. They are the main suppliers of brownies in the US. And if anyone has had Ben & Jerry's ice cream, there's brownies in a lot of our ice cream, and that's not an accident. That's by design to support this work. Actually, our brownie flavor, which I think is one of our top 2 flavors, was created so that we could support Greyston Bakery. Ben of Ben & Jerry's and the founder of Greyston Bakery are actually met years ago and became friends, and had very kind of similar ideas and missions about the role of companies in the community and in social justice work. And then I think, we do a pretty good job of being honest about where we need to do more work in terms of equity and hiring and diversity. We're owned by a large global multinational company, and all of our processes have to run through our parent company. And sometimes we're at odds with them about it, and sometimes it's a laborious process. And so we have to, I think, continue to commit to doing the work internally as we do to the work externally. And I think, especially coming from the movement space, that you can and should be working on both, and that both the external advocacy and the internal advocacy work are a process, right? We're all students in this work. Nobody has figured out the perfect way to be an advocate, the perfect way to be a corporate advocate. And so I try to think of this as we're all students in the practice of justice and liberation, and we don't have to be perfect to commit to trying to be better, both internally and externally. And not feeling like you have a totally clean house should not exempt you or keep you from trying to advocate for a better world on the outside or inside.
That perfectly goes into my last question for you. And then folks, if you have questions, please put them in the chat or the Q&A, because I have more, but I want to share that for other folks if they have questions. But my last one for you is, I imagine a lot of folks aren't sort of the Ben and Jerry's of the world on this call, right? And so you very much exude across the spectrum a lot of work. You're all the way over here in terms of your ability to sort of engage externally and internally. And you've been doing it for quite literally decades. I'm curious to hear what you might sort of advise or recommend to folks in the call who maybe are just beginning their journey, or maybe they're somewhere in the middle, but they're not sort of the biggest company or haven't been doing this for years. What advice would you maybe give to folks in the call who are interested in doing something in the space, but maybe don't know where to start?
That what I just said, I think the reminding yourself that you don't have to feel like you're perfect internally to be able to speak up about an issue externally. Companies are made up of real people who don't just check their beliefs when they walk into their 9-to-5s. I have a stat here that Maggie had shared with me that 59% of consumers say it's no longer acceptable for companies to be silent on social justice issues. And 73% of employees say they would prefer to work for a company with fair chance hiring policies. And 72% of employees say that companies that don't offer fair chance hiring are not truly diverse and inclusive. So people care about this, both your consumers and your employees. People care about this, and they have a lot to offer in this space as well. I think that there's an understanding that the best way that a company can offer support is financially and monetarily, and that's not always necessarily true. Yes, of course, money is great, but I always tell folks to come to the table when you're working with an activism partner with a mindset of abundance. Where can you offer in-kind support? We've seen examples with, we work closely with Seventh Generation. They're often able to offer consumer testing information. And that can be so valuable for campaigns and for social justice organizations. Where can you sign on to something? Where can you get advice from folks from RBIJ and from B Corps? Something that I've realized is that, one of the most powerful tools for organizing these days is digital tools, organic, paid media campaigns. And companies like Ben & Jerry's are sitting on these incredible world-class marketers, digital teams who can take the same resources they use to, say, sell ice cream, and use those resources to support social justice campaigns. And that's what we do every day at Ben & Jerry's. That's in-kind support. That's talent and skills that are already sitting on your team. So I think there's a great opportunity in corporations to be a little bit innovative and creative about where are the different places that you can start and offer support. And often there's a lot of infrastructure that's already set up that you might not be thinking of that would be greatly beneficial to a campaign. I hope that's helpful.
It's really helpful and really inspiring. Thank you. Grace, I'm going to pass it back to you. And I think there might be a few
Thank you all.
questions.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Palika, and thank you, Maggie, for facilitating that. I'm going to take over for a bit while we take some questions from you guys. This can be for anyone you've heard from today. I do see a question in the chat already. And also please feel free to raise your hand if you would like to voice over your own question, but I'll read the question from Lauren in the chat. And Palika, I believe this is for you. How does your team decide which topics or causes to invest in or advocate for?
That's a great question. There's not like a set kind of formula for how we do that. A lot of it is leaning on our brand heritage, which is convenient for us. Ben & Jerry are activists themselves, and so they've brought in a certain there's a certain we have like friends of Ben & Jerry's. We've already got kind of this like deep heritage and history of people that we work with and issues that we advocate on. And the other is relying on folks like myself, our activism leads. I get to very much dictate what our strategy is and who our partners are and what it makes sense for us to be talking about. But our kind of broad framework here is that we're focused on campaigns that are going to drive tangible action. I think creating awareness, education is super important, and there's definitely a role for all of that. But for us, our model is focused on driving change. We're actually we want to drive specific numbers to push through a piece of legislation. We want to drive specific numbers to reach a politician. So that's kind of one frame that we use. And then our work is always focused on the criminal legal system and racial justice. That's kind of become our niche area, which a lot of different things touch those areas. And I think, but I think it's unique, right? Because some companies, it makes sense to focus on issues that have some sort of relation to your product. But for us, we go far and wide, and that's really worked for us.
Thank you. All right, I'll go to Kel. What is your answer to a company who says they are scared to take a political or social justice chance, who might be worried about striking up controversy among their clients or customers?
It's a really valid concern. It's not like we don't receive blowback. We received a ton of blowback just last year around a post we made for 4th of July, threats of boycotts. We got attacked by the whole go woke, go broke contingency, and that stuff's real, and it scares people, and it impacts people internally and externally. These are real people's jobs and incomes that are on the line, and we have to be really honest about that. What I would say is that when this work is done ethically and authentically, and you're surrounded by community, there is a sense of protection. We have, even last year when I don't really have time to get into the details of it, but we had a post around 4th of July that was talking about the land back movement, or for a specific Indigenous community with Mount Rushmore. And we received so much hate for this. And it was scary. People were scared at the office. People, death threats. People were scared for a number of reasons. But we also drove so many actions for this organization. And we had so many folks from Black-led organizations, from Indigenous-led organizations reach out to us and say, what do you need? We're here for you. Like, we're here in community with you. If you need us to help flank you for comm support, if you need support on XYZ, let us know. And to me, that's just a testament of doing this work ethically and in community, and investing in the right people and spaces, and always being led by folks on the ground.
Thank you. I love several questions in the chat. Love to see it. Keep them coming. Okay, Brittany asks, any advice on how to talk to management about investing more in these types of companies? I'll editorialize a bit, just because I think both on this call and in other B Corp adjacent activism spaces that I've been in, we're not always talking to like C-suite decision makers. So sometimes there's a lot of managing up that has to happen to get projects to work. So would love to hear about your experience with that. But Maggie or Hugues, if you guys want to jump in too to add any more context you've had from your work, that would be great. But Palika, feel free to start if you'd like.
I've been talking a lot. I'm happy to hear from Maggie and Hugues, actually.
I'll be brief. We can pass the baton. I would just say, it's no small thing to have to figure out how to manage up. So just absolutely want to acknowledge that sometimes the folks that are on these calls are not the decision makers, and there's a gap there, and that's challenging. So I just want to say that out loud and hear you. I would say it depends on sort of what you're thinking about, if it's advocacy, so legislation or policy work versus hiring. But I think regardless, this is such a no-brainer, but it's sort of meeting folks wherever they're at. And so in some instances, it will be about the bottom line, right? In some instances, it will say, we know that it's really hard to get talent in the door and keep it there, and you've been struggling to get more folks in the door. And so advocating something like Clean Slate actually helps you open up the talent pool that you have access to, or thinking about people who have a criminal record, that actually allows you to open up that talent pool and get more people in the door. And sometimes folks will say, that's actually how I opened the conversation up, because I knew there was a problem and we had a solution that was available that also worked for us. That was sort of a policy issue, or a hiring issue. And I think sometimes it's also just getting to the heart of the mission or your values. And so sometimes I think you can say, I know that we advocate for these things, or we said that our mission is this thing, but I think we're missing the mark here, or here's a way to actually elevate it a little bit more. So I would say it's not always as easy as that sounds, but I would say meet folks wherever they're at. And if it is from more of the money or from more of the actual people, talent in the door, that's one way of looking at it. And then the other way, that's more practical, right? The other way is a bit more about sort of the mission and values and sort of finding a way to align any of these issues with what's already happening or what your goals are internally. But yeah, Hugues.
No, well said, Maggie. I would also just add, understanding the why, it's very important in understanding that, but also start with pilot programs. There's really no reason to try to take on the world. And oftentimes most companies can find those who are already leading in these areas and pretty much can collaborate, right? So there's ways to engage without having to feel like you're all in the event that there's some sort of retraction around this engagement. And so what we've seen in our ecosystem is a lot of piloted programs. I intentionally start our programs with very small piloted, with case studies, storytelling components in order for those voices to be uplifted. And so this way, once those voices are shared, it shifts hearts and minds. It gets the company, it gets the community to understand like, oh, wow, like this impacted me in a whole different way that I did not realize, right? And so how can we get a bit more invested here, right? How we can go deeper here. So start small, have a conversation, a courageous conversation, identify the why, and be able to identify an organization that may already be leading in this, or a coalition or a collective that's already leading in this, and find ways to engage with that coalition in whatever capacity your organization can. And then from there, start to see how you can scale your engagement. And that's where I would say to start. It's a safe try. And there's really no harm done here in terms of feeling like, you've overstepped or you've caused harm, because again, your engagement is starting very small. So that's what I would offer. And I think, again, everything that both Maggie and Palika have shared is spot on in terms of how we start to have those courageous conversations with our businesses.
I would just tack on one thing to that. And there's a real unintended, I think, benefit of doing this work too. Consumers, they want this from companies, although we don't do this work to increase our bottom line, we've seen that customers who know about our social mission, because not everyone knows about our social mission, but customers who know about our social mission or take part in our activism campaigns are 2.5 times more likely to be loyal to just our brand, more likely to say that we're their favorite ice cream company. Something like 65% of people who know our social mission or take action in our campaigns are more likely to say they'll spend more money to buy Ben & Jerry's. And so there's a real unintended benefit to the company as well. And I think there's a lot of data that shows that consumers are looking for that from a company as well, that you could probably use to make your case.
Yeah, we're coming up on time here, but I want to try to just in my conclusion briefly address some questions that Emmy and Lauren both had about kind of how to manage time and capacity. Maybe it's because you're at a small company, or maybe it's because you're feeling blocked at a higher level, like how to manage doing like core pieces of your job with advocacy. This is not a complete solution, but one reason that I'm excited about B Lab's new standards is that to maintain B Corp certification, there will be a collective action requirement that has to be met every year. And there will be other pieces, like I mentioned, within the JEDI plank and within the human rights plank that can dovetail well into that collective action piece. So and B Lab is going to be working hard to give lots of resources, both, purely educational and also tactical for how to navigate these things. But I think some of the hope is that it will force some of these issues for decision makers at B Corps. We have to do this to maintain certification. What's the best way to do it? And that's where I see there might be an opening for some people who are passionate about these issues, but maybe not quite at like an executive decision-making level, to use that opening and to use the resources that B-Lab, that RBIJ, that we learned from the experience of companies like Ben & Jerry's, use those resources to say, hey, we have a path forward here, we have resources here, and we actually need to do this to maintain our certification or to achieve certification. So I'm hoping that provides some sort of opening. And I know that's not a complete total answer, but it is one of the reasons I'm excited about the new standards, even though I know it'll require some transition. But we are a minute away from the top of the hour, so I'm going to drop some resources here, and I will also share these via email. But we have a bi-monthly policy collaboration call at B-Lab. The next one is in August. That's a space where kind of like this, but it's a little wider ranging. We talk about issues we see coming up. B Corps can bring issues that are important to them. Sometimes I invite on partners who are expert in certain topic areas. It's really a place to like brainstorm and think through opportunities together with people who are the most active and interested in B Corp advocacy. And then we think through how we can pull a wider audience of B Corps and non-B Corps into that work. We also have a really wonderful and in-depth page on racial equity resources from B-Lab that I linked there. And if you have any questions on resources you see there, please feel free to email myself or Hugues. I'll share out both of our emails too when I follow up. But this is a good like starting place to go to when you're thinking through like what examples are there of B Corps or other companies that I could follow. We mentioned Grayston Bakery a couple times here. They're featured here. So if you want to like dive more in depth on some of these topics, that's a good place to start. As is the racial equity video that Hugues helps lead on putting together last year and into early this year. That highlights some of the breadth of ways you can engage with racial equity as a broad topic, but also highlights Grayston Bakery. So it does go into this open hiring thing that we've been focusing more on here. And that is the end of the resources I have right now. So I will send out a follow-up email with the recording from this, with these resources, with some emails that you can reach out to for more support. Thank you so much, Palika, for joining us. Really appreciate all your insights and all the work you've been doing for a long time. I'm interested in talking to you more about some of your previous experiences. Thank you, Hugues, for joining us from Brazil. Really appreciate it. And Maggie, of course, thank you. We're so excited to be working more closely with RBIJ. B-Lab is a convener. We have a lot of interested business, but we are not topic matter experts on a lot of stuff. So we're always grateful to find new partners who can help us be smarter about the advocacy we're doing. But thank you all so much and enjoy the rest of your afternoon. It's almost the weekend, so enjoy your weekend too. Bye, y'all.